In this, the ninth lesson in the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we discuss the rise of the militarized industrial nation-states competing for the control over territory, over natural resources, and the political domination over the people occupying other lands. One of history's least discussed facts is that the cost of war is rarely paid for by taxation of those with the most to gain or lose. Britain's experience in the First World War is typical. In 1918, Britain's national debt exceeded £7 billion. To avoid widespread labor unrest and strikes, a portion of what was borrowed went to raising nominal wages for workers. The trades unions seemed to be gaining strength in the political arena, but this was to be tested repeatedly in the post-war years. Rural agriculture also expanded to replace the loss of imports, with the side effect of driving up agricultural land prices and requiring farmers to take on higher levels of debt. Then, as always occurs after the end of war, falling commodity prices caused many farmers to default on loans. Foreclosures followed. France ended the First World War in more desperate financial and economic circumstances than Britain. The wealthy in France had moved over half of the nation's financial reserves into overseas investments. France's national debt skyrocketed while tax revenue plummeted. And in Russia, the stage was set for a Bolshevik takeover. Russia's Minister of the Interior, Peter Stolypin, hoped to stem peasant unrest by creating a class of market-oriented, small-holding landowners. Failing this, he predicted the worst. The legislative institutions and the intellectual opposition parties, lacking real authority in the eyes of the people, will be powerless to stem the popular tide aroused by themselves, and Russia will be flung into hopeless anarchy, the issue of which cannot be foreseen. After riots occurred in Petrograd, the autocracy fell. Alexander Kerensky became head of a new government, but was unable to stabilize the situation, and chaos spread throughout Russia. Under Leon Trotsky's leadership, the Bolsheviks emerged as a dominant revolutionary group. In November, Lenin arrived in Petrograd to head a new government. Lenin uniquely understood the near impossibility of bringing the Marxist vision of socialism to Russia. Facing this reality, he wrote, "Only by the hard and long path of self-discipline would it be possible to overcome the disintegration that the war had caused in capitalist society. That only by extraordinarily hard, long, and persistent effort could we cope with this disintegration and defeat those elements aggravating it, elements which regarded the revolution as a means of discarding old fetters and getting as much out of it for themselves as they possibly could." And this meant a long period of hardship, deprivation, and relentless elimination of any resistance to the new regime of state socialism. Lenin justified these measures because the emergence of a large number of such elements was inevitable in a small peasant country at a time of incredible economic chaos, and the fight against these elements that is ahead of us will be 100 times more difficult. It will be a fight which promises no spectacular opportunities. In the United States, Woodrow Wilson determined to use the powers of government to create a more level playing field than had existed since the closing of the frontier. Tariff reductions were implemented early in 1913. The 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, allowing a 1% tax on individual incomes above $3,000, and an additional 1 to 6% tax on incomes above $20,000 and up. To counter monopolies, the Clayton Antitrust Act was passed late in 1914. In his book, The New Freedom, Wilson stated his case against the monopolies. He wrote, "They are rapidly making us outsiders with respect even of the things that come from the bosom of the earth and which belong to us in a peculiar sense. Certain monopolies in this country have gained almost complete control of the raw material, chiefly in the mines, out of which the great body of manufactures are carried on, and they now discriminate, when they will, in the sale of that raw material between those who are rivals of the monopoly and those who submit to the monopoly. We must soon come to the point where we shall say to the men who own these essentials of industry that they have got to part with these essentials by sale to all citizens of the United States with the same readiness and upon the same terms. Or else we shall tie up the resources of this country under private control in such fashion as will make our independent development absolutely impossible." Wilson appointed David Houston, Chancellor of Washington University in St. Louis, to his cabinet. Houston held an M.A. in political science from Harvard University and became Secretary of Agriculture, then Secretary of the Treasury in 1920. His tenure in the cabinet occurred during years of great challenges and controversies. At the end of the First World War, Houston forecasted the decline in demand and prices for U.S. agricultural products. For farmers who had already taken on heavy debt to acquire additional acreage during the war years, Houston called for easier credit while urging farmers to take land out of cultivation and reduce output. But when prices fell more dramatically than expected in 1920, farm spokesmen unfairly accused Houston of deliberately wrecking agrarian prosperity. While economists generally grasped at straws to explain the growing number of farm foreclosures, the journalist and historian Frederick Lewis Allen provided the necessary clarity in his book, Only Yesterday. Allen wrote, "At the very outset of the decade, there had been a sensational market in farmlands, caused by the phenomenal prices brought by wheat and other crops during and immediately after the war. Prices of farm property leaped. Thousands of mortgages and loans were based upon these exaggerated values, and when the bottom dropped out of the agricultural markets in 1920-21, the distress of the farmers was intensified by the fact that in innumerable cases they could not get money enough from their crops to cover the interest due at the bank or to pay the taxes which were now levied on the increased valuation. Thousands of country banks, saddled with mortgages and loans in default, ultimately went to the wall." Wilson realized his success depended on consolidation of his power within the ranks of the Democratic Party. To Josephus Daniel, Secretary of the Navy, he said, "I would rather trust a machine senator when he is committed to your program than a talking liberal who can never quite go along with others because of his admiration of his own patented plan of reform." As the United States embarked on a military buildup in 1916, progressives and isolationists joined forces in protest over how the cost would be paid for. One of the main opposition groups, the Association for an Equitable Federal Income Tax, included the philosopher John Dewey and Commissioner of Ellis Island Frederick C. Howe. They demanded that the burden be carried by those who stood to gain most from wartime expenditures and responded to critics of income taxation by noting that the direct income tax is designed to reduce the inequality of sacrifice involved in our indirect tax system. Economists have been debating for at least the last century over whether the taxation of consumption is either sound economics or sound public policy. Sales taxes tend to be regressive, yet taxes on some forms of consumption, such as tobacco products, alcoholic beverages, or anything with too much sugar content, are argued for as, quote, sin taxes. When the United States entered the war, Wilson declared his administration would pay for the war out of current taxes rather than borrowing that imposed costs on future generations. Others argued that future generations would benefit by an Allied victory and argued the case for the issuance of bonds. The Congress subsequently passed an Emergency Loan Act, which authorized the issuance of $5 billion in bonds at the below-market interest rate of 3.5%. Liberty bonds sold well, demonstrating the depth of patriotism among the working and middle classes of the United States. The wealthy remained out of the Liberty bond market, unwilling to accept low yields. Remarkably, Columbia University economics professor Edwin Seligman advanced a proposal to subject the interest on Liberty bonds to taxation. An investment banker named Otto Kuhn warned that a high surtax rate on income could lead wealthy individuals to move to Canada. The wealthy managed to hold on to most of their assets during the war, despite heavier taxation. When the war ended, a prominent businessman named Charles Lord went before the National Industrial Conference Board to urge immediate repeal of taxes on personal wealth and income. He argued, "The emergency is past, and we should promptly discard a theory of taxation which is both so uncertain and working so many evil results, and should seek a method which will be surer in its incidence, more equitable in its operation, and simpler in its collection." Can such a way be found? Certainly. As soon as we commence to tax what people spend instead of what they save, we are on the right road. So once again, the idea of the consumption tax or sales tax came under consideration. Mississippi was the first state to adopt a sales tax in 1930. Many other states followed in an effort to raise needed revenue during the Great Depression. Just 5 states, Alaska, Delaware, Montana, New Hampshire, and Oregon, have not adopted a statewide sales tax. Economists would continue to debate how revenue ought to be raised to pay for public goods and services. The economics and politics of taxation remain conflicted then as now, influenced by the power of powerful vested interests. The consequences of the First World War on the lives of people in much of the world were devastating. Now, although the war emergency had ended, another legacy of the war was the spread of disease. If asked to name one event responsible for 40 million deaths globally in the early 1900s, many individuals would guess World War I. In fact, deaths attributed to World War I, while still very significant, were roughly half that number. The influenza pandemic, or Spanish flu of 1918, claimed 40 million lives worldwide over 18 months. 675,000 of those deaths occurred in the United States. What also occurred in the United States during the war was the creation of a full employment economy. Now with peace, the great concern was that the demand for weapons and armaments would not be replaced by a demand for consumer goods. Additionally, exports of agricultural products to European markets would eventually lose value as Europe's farmers were able to clear fields of unexploded ordnance, then plant and harvest crops. And even though the First World War had come to an end, the United States remained a nation divided in so many ways, not the least of which was the economic circumstances of its households. Would there be enough jobs for returning veterans? If not, should the government embark on public works projects and other initiatives to ease re-entry into civilian life? Although the Council of Economic Advisors to the U.S. President did not become a formal part of government until after the Second World War, the work of economists focused on market forces, but they were also increasingly hired by government to perform specific types of policy work. There was Irving Fisher, born in 1867, who rose to become one of the most prominent American economists of the early 20th century. Fisher was a trained mathematician who later obtained the first doctorate degree in economics awarded by Yale University. Among the issues studied by his generation were: do tariffs and quotas actually stimulate the development of new domestic industries? How should government raise its revenue? How should infrastructure be paid for? Are industrial and other monopolies harmful to an economy? Should a nation restrict immigration or even the outmigration of people? A student of Irving Fisher at Yale named Harry Gunnison Brown joined the Yale faculty after completing his doctorate degree in 1909. Then, in 1915, he left for the University of Missouri, where he remained until 1951. One significant difference between the two economists was that Brown had read and absorbed Henry George's works early on, and George's influence on his thinking remained with him. In a paper published in 1921, Brown raised the important issue of distinguishing between earned and unearned income for purposes of taxation. Brown wrote, "In present-day economic society, incomes are divided into wages for labor, including profits to self-employed labor, interest on capital, and rent on land. Wages of labor are earned or unearned, as the terms are here used, according as they are received for an equivalent service rendered. Interest is unearned when the capital is used in antisocial and exploitative ways. It is earned when the use of the capital confers an equivalent benefit upon those from whom, in the last analysis, the interest is drawn. As to land, its rent resulting from natural advantages or from advantages of situation relative to population centers, pure rent as distinguished from interest on improvements, is clearly unearned, and is no less unearned because the owner may have paid some previous recipient the so-called value of the land for the privilege of getting a return from the rest of the community for no service rendered. And the rent of land is unearned whether the land is used in socially desirable ways or not, for in any case, the owner is in no sense responsible for the existence or the advantages for business of his land." And now we've reached the end of Lesson 9.